What's up, folks? This is Kyle Thomas from Exhorter, and you're watching AFTERSHOCKS TV.
All right, AFTERSHOCKS TV. We're back this week with another episode for everybody, and this week we're doing something a little different on this episode this week. But before we get into our topic here, I'd like to welcome my co-host for this week, a familiar name and face. We haven't seen this gentleman in quite some time on the CMS network, but he is an alumni of the network. He's been doing his. We'll get into it a little bit. We'll talk about it a little bit, Tanner, about what you've been doing over the last year, or whatever, or so. But of course, we got Mr. Tanner Poppitt from Poppitt's Corner. What's going on, Tanner? Great to see you. Oh, look at that. Look
right
at
the exact moment.
I guess you're doing great with those fireworks, man. Absolutely.
I'm on fire, dude. Yeah,
You are.
I'm doing good, man. Thanks again for having me. I've missed everybody. I hope all is well with the fans and everyone on the network. And well, we'll get into it, but been doing a lot. So that is primarily the reason why I am, that's primarily why you haven't seen me in a while. So
Yeah,
how you been, Matt? What's going on with you?
Doing good. You know, just doing what I've been doing for the last 5 years. A lot of these shows. Obviously, we got AFTERSHOCKS TV. As you know, I kind of put that in the back burner for about a year after the passing of our late great good friend Bob Nalbandian, and started up this past year. You know, me and Tom Brennan have been doing most of the episodes here, and we've had Chris on a couple, Chris Aiken, of course, and I've got a new podcast as well called, video cast, whatever you want to call it, called Seismic Sounds of the Underground, which is more on the underground heavy rock, doom metal, stoner rock scene. That's pretty prevalent these days. As you know, we'll get into it later, as you've been kind of getting in those waters yourself a little bit lately, as we'll talk maybe towards the end of this episode. But yeah, everything's good, man. AFTERSHOCKS TV is back. It's great to have you on. Obviously, you've been on AFTERSHOCKS TV in the past, talking about Madrost, your band, and of course, Poppitt's Corner, and a bunch of other topics we've discussed. And I appreciate you coming on and talking about a very important topic to me this week. And of course, that's we're doing a tribute episode this week from the band LEEWAY. This past week, we had the unfortunate news of vocalist Eddie Pompanios, a.k.a. Eddie Sutton, Eddie LEEWAY, vocalist of LEEWAY, passed away after his 4-year battle with lung cancer. Eddie, he hung on for quite a long time there, 4 years, which is a lot for lung cancer, obviously. He really fought to the end. But obviously between his passing and, of course, as you see behind me, he's right behind me with another one of my favorite guitarists, one of my favorite musicians out of New York City, Mr. Michael Gibbons. He recently passed away as well in December 2023, late last year. So two, legendary guys and a legendary band for me that have passed. And unfortunately, Tanner, Eddie and Mike were the only guys that were really keeping the LEEWAY name alive for the last handful of years. Eddie had been going out touring with the band. Well, he's doing his own version of the band, I should say, called LEEWAY NYHC. Michael would get up there and he'd play with Eddie sometimes as well. And Mike, of course, put together the documentary that came out last year as well in 2023 that I was blessed to have been fortunate enough to have been included in. And so, yeah, with both of them gone now, it sort of really marks the end of the band, man. And so it's been, this is obviously, I'm from Queens. It's a band from Queens in New York. And so this band has a special place in my heart and for pretty much no longer going to be. And so I wanted to do sort of a little tribute today about them. And so I appreciate you, joining me for this episode, man.
Absolutely. Yeah. Looking forward to it, man. I remember the first time I heard LEEWAY. It was a while ago. And I believe the film that you particularly were in, I believe it was the last one as well with Bob. I don't know if that was the last one he's ever was a part of, but it was it was really cool to see you guys in it. It was an interesting watch because it made me rediscover, even though primarily that film was solely kind of all the information was taken from like the first two records, because I think that was, obviously those are their I mean, those are their classics. You know, you can't go wrong with Born to Expire and Desperate Measures. So it's like, you know, but yeah, it was really interesting to learn a lot about the band. You know, and yeah, it's awesome. Again, thanks again for having me, man. But I remember the first time I heard them, if I can just briefly touch upon it, and
Please.
maybe you can,
Yeah.
I would love to know your thoughts and when you discovered them as well, because it'd be interesting. Again, you're a little older than I am, so you probably discovered them probably in the 90s, I'm assuming. Mine was like 2010.
Okay.
So about 14, 15 years ago at this point. I remember being in college and a random kid, for some reason in one of my classes, had this t-shirt on. And it's, if you I don't know if you have the album covers handy, but it was the Born to Expire LP, which I had never heard of Leeway, to be honest with you, at that point. But to me, that specific album cover is pretty iconic for at least the speed metal kind of era. So I actually discovered them all with that specific album, and when I heard when I basically heard it, it was like life-changing. It's a weird album. Eddie has like a very unique voice for that style of music.
Yes.
And it was kind of my first time hearing New York hardcore-ish. I don't know if you can consider it a hardcore band or a thrash band. I was just mostly, a lot of like punk guys were into it. So I found out about Leeway through through a punk rocker in college.
Interesting. Very, it's interesting you say through a punk rock, being Orange County, because, Bob, speaking of Bob, that's how he discovered them too back in the 80s, was through some punk rock friends. But what's interesting is, they obviously, yes, they're considered a New York hardcore band, but when you go, and this is obviously these two records up here, as you mentioned, Born to Expire, and right next to it, they're Desperate Measures. When you listen to it, though, there's not much punk really in the music. It to me, it's a straight up, and a lot of people, it's basically, they basically took a blend of Metallica riffs and the attitude with the New York hardcore, say with the Agnostic Front, and they sort of blended them. It's classic New York hardcore crossover, I should say, a classic crossover band, crossover thrash. Of course, they've got the speed of punk, but riff wise, straight up mostly. I mean, those riffs are straight, Metallica laden riffs, more thrashy riffs. But it's interesting because Bob had said the same thing, and he discovered them as well through punk fans. And so it's kind of interesting that, punk crowd is what really introduced Leeway to you and Bob. Whereas for me and most people, I think on the East Coast, was more the opposite. It was more through the, the metal, the crossover, the thrash metal fans. But yes, the first time I heard Leeway, you're correct, it was in the 90s. Obviously they were around in the 80s, but I'm 48 years old. I was, when they were playing, in the late 80s, and they were playing in the clubs and so forth in New York City, I was still only like 13 or so. So I wasn't really, I was right in that cusp. I wasn't old enough just yet where I was seeing them live. The first time I heard them was, they actually it was on their second record, Desperate Measures. They had a video on Headbangers Ball for the song called Kingpin, which is a really cool song. It's not, like I said, it's not my favorite song by any means. Even, if I had to pick a song to have people check out, that wouldn't have been the one. But at the time, it was pretty, I don't want to use the word groundbreaking, but it was different because it did have a little, it was more groovier. As you said before, Born to Expire was really straight up thrash and hardcore, fast the whole time, straight, just super speed. Whereas Desperate Measures, like a lot of things that happened towards the end of the decade in the 80s and in the early 90s there, it got a little, it was more groovy, had more of the groove metal elements. But it had a little bit of blend of each. But the song Kingpin that was on Headbangers Ball, which we're going to, play for everyone here in a little bit, that had actually some more urban influences in it. Even some hip, he kind of semi-rapped, if you want to call it, in a part or two in it. Now you're right. You mentioned before how Eddie, his voice, and that's really, with Eddie's passing, that's the thing. To me, Eddie was the best frontman, not just his stage presence, but his voice in New York hardcore history. because nobody could sing like Eddie. Eddie could sing. He was a real vocalist. You know, he was a singer. I mean, he didn't, you know, most New York hardcore and thrash bands, right? They were just kind of doing your harsh vocals or doing more of the aggressive vocals, where Eddie had a great voice. And I mean, he was into, you know, he would listen to like Billie Holiday and James Brown. He was into a lot of soul and funk from the 70s, and it shows with his, you know, his style of you know, singing. And so, yeah, you're correct. He was very different than any other New York hardcore singer and frontman.
Now, I don't know what it is about New York specifically. I know you and Tom did an episode on you know, like Anthrax being like a precursor to the whole rap metal thing. I would almost put Leeway in as well, with because they were doing it was the whole New York thing was kind of adding that hip hop flavor, and a lot of hip hop was coming from, you know, New York, so they didn't really have the internet, so they were I'm sure that all blended and influenced each other, and that's how hardcore punk became New York hardcore became a thing. So I just wanted to add that onto that episode that you guys did too. I would almost argue and make a case for Leeway, because there's a few songs on Desperate Measures that really kind of blend those two, you know, well, 9-10 years before you had the Limp Bizkits and things like that. So just want to preference that as well.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. You're right. You know, they were really, it's kind of funny you say that too, because obviously in the early 90s, New York hardcore, yeah, you're right. It really started to it went groovy, and then it not only went groovy, but it did take on those super urban element, you know, urban influence, I should say, urban influences. Obviously, the biggest name of the band that took it and really wrote it and became super successful was Biohazard. And yes, you know, obviously Biohazard was around at the same time. They put out their first record in about 1990, and their debut record, and it was around the same time when Desperate Measures came out. Even though Desperate Measures, I think, was already done by like 89, I think, and didn't come out till I think 91. Because even Born to Expire didn't come out, I believe, till 89. That thing was done in like 87, you know, because they had record label you know, issues that were just holding up the release date for so long. But yeah, no, it's a good point. You know, I mean, and like I said, it was just, you know, Eddie was, you're right, he was the first guy to really have that look too. He you know, the rest of the band, what you see here, Mike had long hair, he was, you know, straight up metalhead. The other guys didn't really have much of the urban influences, but Eddie would kind of run around, you know, with the sport, you know, the sport uniform, you know, gear on. They used to call it B-boy. That was the title for someone who looked like that, a B-boy. You know, he had knee pads on. I mean, yeah, you know, it's typical 80s kind of, you know, interesting style he had. But that's a good point, you know, because yes, they were never like the greatest thing about Leeway is, like you said, they had so many different sort of, you know, I mean, obviously they were a New York hardcore / crossover band, but yes, they definitely brought a lot of other elements into the sound, especially with Desperate Measures. And then obviously getting into the mid 90s, early to mid 90s, a couple of years later after Desperate Measures, they did put out 2 other releases that sometimes people don't know about. But those releases, the third album, Adult Crash, decent album, had a couple of, you know, some good songs, but it was not their best effort. And I think the band has been pretty, you know, obviously admitted that pretty, you know, consistently with interviews and so forth. It wasn't their best record, but their last record, Open Mouth Kiss, that was more of a rock record. Same thing, more of a 90s influence, you know, alternative heavy rock, sort of alternative metal album. And that was actually a really good record. That's where Eddie's voice really shined. He always said that was his, his big moment in terms of where he really felt like he was a real vocalist, that he really did a great job, you know, in the studio and so forth. And it is a really, really good album, Open Mouth Kiss. But yeah, that's a good point there about, yes, they did definitely bring in some of the B-boy and those urban elements for sure from Eddie.
Right. I just wanted to, again, preference that because you guys did a killer episode on it, but that was a point that when watching it, going, man, I hope they mentioned something about, you know, because there are other bands that did the same thing that Anthrax did. They were just the big band that, you know, made it popular. But there's the whole New York kind of scene is the reason why you have bands like Limp Bizkit.
I agree.
In my opinion.
No, you're right, dude.
Because again, you had the hip hop thing coming out of there. I mean, Grandmaster Flash was like, you know, from that that whole area, obviously years prior, right? But
Mhm.
New York
Yep.
is kind of where a lot of like that style started to develop. I don't know if that was because of the surrounding area or any of
No,
that
dude,
nature.
it totally was, man. You're 100% right. You know, I always tell people that, you know, when they ask me like what I listened to, you know, in the later part of the 80s and early 90s. Of course, I was always into metal and rock and stuff. But yes, I did get into rap in that time. I probably stopped listening to rap around 94 or so, because then you started having the Tupacs and stuff. And I really wasn't, once that came along, you know, Notorious B.I.G., I wasn't into any of that stuff. So from there onward, I was not, but I do like and really love, enjoy some old school rap from New York City. But yeah, dude, it was everywhere in New York. I mean, that was the thing. Like, you couldn't not be influenced by, and that's why you saw guys in Anthrax, you saw Sky D and all those guys wearing their Public Enemy shirts or whatever. It was really, it was so part of the city, you know, and it was not just on a radio station, but it was really seeping into the culture. So it was completely normal for you to be into hardcore and metal and also listen to rap, because it was kind of, you know, if you look back, I don't want to make this all of a sudden into a hip hop or a rap podcast, but just explain a little bit what you're talking about there. If you listen to the old stuff, the beats and everything is very rock oriented. You know, I mean, they took obviously some rock samples and they took old blues samples and so forth. But it was their sort of rock and roll. You know, I mean, these guys didn't know how to play instruments. You know, they came from poverty, so they weren't getting lessons. They didn't have all the gear and everything. And so they just were taking their parents' records and they were just singing over them. And so using samples and so forth. But it was so entrenched in the New York City culture that I don't know of hardly anybody that wasn't influenced, you know, or listened to at least some rap at the time. And it just naturally, obviously, yes, blended, you know, in with the rock because of, you know, just urban. Now, just and quickly, you know, I was talking about, you know, before, you know, a little bit about, you know, I guess why Leeway didn't take off, you know, like they should have, right? Well, like you mentioned the two records, as we said, Desperate Measures and Born to Expire, you know, super classics. A lot of it was label, you know, because of the record label. You know, they were on Profile Records, which was pretty much a rap label. You know, it was an urban label. You know what I mean? So, I mean, and New York hardcore was an urban style of music. That's the thing. It's, even though it was heavy and, you know, a lot of metal influences and so forth, those bands are all from the inner city. And so New York hardcore had, you know, such a, you know, a conglomerate, amalgamation of all these different styles. That's what, see, New York hardcore back in the 80s it wasn't necessarily like this one style, you know, where everyone looked the same way or they sounded the same way. It was all a bunch of different sounding, where people looked, everything. It was just being an individual. And Eddie, you know, I interviewed Eddie back about 3 years, actually it was 4 years ago during the pandemic. Yeah, 4 years ago, 2020, after the pandemic. He was one of the first interviews, top, you know, maybe first 10 or 15 interviews we did for AFTERSHOCKS. And I interviewed him, and that's what he was kind of, you know, was mentioning about hardcore back then it was about being an individual. If you were someone who's an individual and you didn't necessarily fit in, you know, to a group or whatever, you know, you call it, that's what New York hardcore was all about. There wasn't like a dress code or a musical code that you had to sound like this or look like this to be part of it. And LEEWAY is a perfect example of that, because no one looked and sounded and dressed like Eddie, you know, and he was one of the biggest vocalists, obviously. So, but just quickly, yes, Profile Records signed them. Like I said, Born to Expire was done in 87. The record had already been out. So all the fans in New York City already knew about the record. They had it. They'd had the tape that they bought at the shows, and yet that thing didn't come out till 2 years later. And so by the time these records all came out, Desperate Measures, you know, 2 years later and so forth, these things already been done. You know, fans already been hearing these songs played live before. And it was just, it was a bad label. All the bands that were on there, Cro-Mags was on Profile, LEEWAY, Murphy's Law, and then the only other non-New York, but was a non-New York band called Wargasm, which, if people listen to Shockwave Skull Sessions, Bob Mayo, who was a regular on there a few times, that was his band from Boston. Yeah, so.
Absolutely.
Shake his head, hit him
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. All classic bands who release classic records, right?
Yep.
Now I gotta mention this too, is what has maintained, in your opinion, because the documentary didn't really touch upon it, I would have loved to have heard more on the subject, is what has kept the name alive? Like, why was I shown Leeway in 2010 by a punk rocker? You know what I mean? Like, why, like, how did it carry on through these records? Obviously classics, right? They didn't really get wide distribution.
No.
Yes, they were, they had a video on MTV. But what do you think, in your opinion, has kept the band to where we're still talking about them even till this day? You know, was it the Mike Gibbons guitar playing and the riffs and the vocals and the songs, or I'm just generally curious, or is it the iconic album cover, or?
I would, it's a good question. When I think back into like the late 90s, I remember there was a reissue for both of these records on this label called Another Planet. And I remember, and they were doing it with the Crowbags. They did it with a bunch of bands, about a handful of bands, say a bunch, but a handful of bands that maybe, they would just re-release the records on CD. These are albums that came out in the 80s, so they weren't really on CD at the time, right? They were just on vinyl. So they re-released them on CD and they kind of packaged them together. I remember buying the Leeway one because I kept hearing Leeway. It's kind of funny. Even when I heard the Kingpin video back in the early 90s, when they put out their third album, Adult Crash, I remember listening to one of those like Sunday night shows, metal shows, and back in, I think it was in Long Island, actually, in New York, and they had a song on there. I remember the guy going, "Oh, Leeway, remember these guys?" He was talking about. It was I remember like it's the first time I was hearing a lot about the band themselves, and I think what's kept them going all these years really is just because they Born to Expire. Really, I would say is the reason, because it's probably considered a top 3 all-time New York hardcore record, along with Cro-Mags' Age of Quarrel and probably Agnostic Front's Victim in Pain. Those are probably the 3 quintessential. If you ask anybody, give me 3 records to listen to that has that good old-fashioned quintessential New York hardcore sound, those are the 3 records that most people will tell you is what really catapulted, the genre itself. I think with Leeway now, that what separates them from, say, a Cro-Mags or from Agnostic Front, I mean, it's the musicianship. You know what I mean? I mean, like you said, like Mike Gibbons, I don't know if people understand really what an amazing guitarist this guy was. I mean, technically, I mean, he's obviously only on the 2 records. He didn't play on the 3rd and 4th records. He was out of the band by then. And you mentioned the movie and the documentary real quick. We'll get into that a little bit, but it was really Mike Gibbons' story. It was his take on the Leeway, chapter from those 2 records. But Mike, I remember Eddie was saying that, Mike was the kind of guy, every neighborhood always had, was known to have a guitarist that was a bit of a prodigy. And Mike was sort of Queens' prodigy, guitar wise. And he tried out for the band and he got in very quickly, and he could do things that really, New York hardcore, other guys in New York hardcore bands couldn't do. I mean, New York hardcore, remember, you think about it, it really derived from punk. And we all know punk isn't the best musicality wise. You know what I mean? But Mike came from more of a classic metal background. He was into Iron Maiden. He was into Judas Priest. He was more of a metalhead. The other guitarist, AJ, who was just, one of the best riff. I mean, the riffs on these records is unbelievable. Obviously, Eddie said, they obviously were influenced by bands like Metallica, like everybody was at the time. So they sort of took that thrash, but then they kind of, gave it that sort of punk hardcore edge to it. And, between those two guitarists, they can go back and forth. Like I said, Mike's phenomenal lead. I mean, he could play anything Eddie Van Halen stuff. I mean, that's, he could play Eruption. He could play all that stuff like easily. I mean, he's just phenomenal. When you have those two guitarists going back and forth, one can shred with crazy riffs. Yeah, great tone. I mean, that's the thing too. I think the tone on those records, guitar-wise, are just phenomenal. And then, like I said, it comes down to Eddie's voice. There's no other singer in New York hardcore that sung like Eddie. If you look at those other bands I mentioned, you look at Cro-Mags. So Cro-Mags really never known for their vocals. I mean, John Joseph, I think he's a good singer. Back then when he started out, though, their first record, Age of Quarrel, he was sick when he recorded it. When we talked to Paris Mayhew, I mean, he had a cold. He was sick. So it's not the greatest, vocals in the world on an album. And then, of course, Roger Merritt, with Agnostic Front, he just has his own style, but there's nothing, musically, technically that's really good about it. Eddie could sing. He could sing soulfully. He could sing heavy, and he just would fly around the stage. So I think just because of their live shows and their music from back in the day and their musicality, in 2010, well, right around that time, you had a lot of the 80s nostalgia kicking in. And so this is an 80s band, right? They started in the 80s. And so people are going back, listening to their old records, or, God, who would I love? I'd love to see LEEWAY. I'd love to, get those records and so forth. And so, I mean, they've always been huge in New York hardcore. You know what I mean? Like, no matter where you went, they were just as big as Cro-Mags and Agnostic Front. They're right up there with them, maybe just a tad below them, because those bands, the difference is those bands continue to put out music over the years, especially to the 90s, where LEEWAY really, Eddie had a bad, admittedly, he's not shy about it. He's talked about it a lot. He had a bad drug problem for a long time, and that's what really hindered their success. They really could have been a big band because of him and those guitarists, but it is what it is, right? That happens to a lot of bands, unfortunately. Yeah,
I would say that Eddie's voice, for me personally, because I'm a big kind of crossover,
sure.
fan.
So am I. Yeah, so am I.
Gangrene would be like the closest I would consider to Eddie's kind of style ish.
Okay.
Yeah. But obviously Gangrene was a punk band that kind of transitioned into more of the thrash. So they were kind of doing it around the same time as LEEWAY.
Oh, yeah,
but
totally.
You're right, with the whole timing thing plays a huge part. Also too, the song choices for the singles probably didn't play a lot in their favor, because they have a lot of great songs. But you're right. I don't think Kingpin would be my choice for a single.
No.
I don't. Like I said, I don't really know whose decision that was. But if you had to choose, which one would you suggest? Where nobody's ever heard it, you get one shot for your music video. Go.
Oh, for LEEWAY, I mean, to me, like, so it's interesting. I am more, maybe because I'm a 90s guy, but I am definitely more of a Desperate Measures guy. I mean, I love Born to Expire, don't get me wrong. I mean, I just got it on vinyl, I mean, I love it. It's right next to it. It's like 1A, 1B, really. But if that's always the question, which one's better? Which one's better? If you ask me, I mean, I think because, like I said, I'm a 90s guy, and I just love all the different influences in that record. They have your hardcore, you got your metal, like you said, you got your groovy stuff. You've got, I mean, it's so, sequenced very well throughout the record. But if you told me, okay, one song to play for someone to really, get LEEWAY, or to me, it's the last song on Desperate Measures, called The Future, Ain't What It Used to Be. That song, just the riff, the tone and the guitar and the riffs on that are just so freaking, I mean, like I said, it's very Hetfield-ish, Metallica, and just awesome, and just a great groove. Like I said, it's more of a groove metal record, and so I'm a huge fan of groove metal. Like, I love thrash, but to me, it's like I love, like, when it just kind of settles down a bit. That's why I love Pantera and Prong and all those bands, Sepultura, because they just kind of, the tempo is just a little bit, slower than your traditional thrash. And so, yeah, the quintessential song, if someone said, give me one song, and I've never heard of these guys before, I want to get what they're about. The last song on Desperate Measures is called The Future Ain't What It Used to Be. That'd be the track.
Interesting. And it's I think it's like the longest track on the album, if I'm not mistaken.
It is. At the end, there's like a part there where it kind of drags on a little bit, but, and it kind of fades out. But it's their best. It's one of the best. One of my favorite, like, quote unquote New York hardcore songs. I mean, that riff and just it fires me up every time I hear it. That just never gets old.
So Desperate Measures, I feel obviously is better produced because it came out a little bit later. It's more of a mature album than Born to Expire. I think Born to Expire has that grit, so maybe more punks were into that because of the grit, because that's part of the style of music. But I really feel like the album cover could have been better on Desperate Measures for me personally. Like,
I agree.
If it wasn't just a shot of the band, with the dead end sign, like look at the album covers. Which one, if you were in a record store and you saw those two album covers, which one would you buy?
Oh, it's no question, of course, Born to Expire. Yeah, I mean, like you said, Born to Expire is a classic album cover. It really is. Not just a classic record, but the album cover is, that's one of my favorite, obviously, album covers ever. So Desperate Measures is not a good cover. You know what I mean? As you can see the difference between, like I said, once again, I don't know whose decision it was to put, what's interesting, you said production wise. Now, really, when talking to with Eddie and Mike, obviously, Mike, me and him did me and Bob did a really cool episode with him and Howie Abrams, and Howie was, one of the big, record executives at the time in New York with the New York hardcore bands, and he later on went on to Roadrunner Records and signed a bunch of, he even went on, a bunch of bands on that label. He even went on to, sign like some Grammy Award winning bands later on. He's a great musical mind, and also he's from my hometown, Queens Village, which is really cool because it's kind of a town in Queens that not some people never talk about. But yeah, man, those guys will tell you actually they disagree. They like the Born to Expire production better. And if you do listen to it, and the reason why is, Eddie was never really happy, and I kind of see it, what he says now, but he was never happy with the vocals in Desperate Measures because the effects that were put on it. If you listen to Born to Expire, it's just him straight up singing. If you listen to Desperate Measures, he was actually, it's pretty interesting. I didn't know this, but when I was talking to Mike, I don't know if it was Mike or Eddie, but they were saying he was being compared. It's in the movie too. It's in the LEEWAY documentary about the effects were very similar to Ozzy Osbourne's in his, No More Tears album. And if you listen to it, and it's true, I think they use sort of the same effect for it, and it sounds a little muddled or whatever you want to call it. I mean, Eddie's got a great voice. He didn't really need a lot of effects. Even though I love that album, like I said, I'm still more of a Desperate Measures fan. I'll just a tad. I can see what they were talking about in terms of the production, the vocals. So both of these records were recorded. It's funny you mentioned Gangrene, because Gangrene, I think, recorded their albums in the same place, which may be why it makes sense why it sounds kind of similar. It's up in the Normandy, what do you call it, studios up in Rhode Island. A lot of bands recorded there. Cro-Mags. I mean, you can. It's funny at that place. You can listen to records. I could pinpoint it from the drums, the sound. Like when I first heard Gangrene's Older Budweiser, I remember listening and hearing the drum sound going. That's the Normandy sound. That's it. Like I could tell it is. And I looked it up and boom, that's it. It really has a unique. There was a very unique mixing board or something in that studio that gave it really this unique sound. That everybody, Born to Expire was the first, I believe, album that was actually recorded there, and then everybody else was doing the pilgrimage up there because they wanted that sound, that guitar tone, which they would never able to do. All these bands tried to do it, but they couldn't do it.
Now, here's another question for you, because growing up in New York, you probably have a different perspective than I would say in California, not being born yet.
Sure.
But I'm curious when LEEWAY first came on the scene and like where the scene was at that time, their influence on and how it inspired like the whole realm of the bands coming out of that time, or was it an amalgamation of just all the bands playing together? And then because New York has their own. Anytime I hear a New York band or like a Boston band or East Coast, they have this unique sound that like California doesn't have. And I don't know, I was trying to kind of pinpoint it before we even got on here. And like what is the sound of New York bands and East Coast bands compared to like California bands? And I don't know if it's the atmosphere or the bands that were coming out at the time or the styles or so what would you say LEEWAY provided to the New York kind of hardcore scene that wasn't there before?
Well, I don't know if there really is any, to be honest with you. Now, the reason why is this: like I was mentioning before, both those records came out long after they were recorded, right? So by the time those, like I said, Born to Expire, 87, that was done, didn't come out to 89, right? It was already an old record. Desperate Measures, same, a little bit different because that wasn't necessarily, I don't think put out, but they were playing those songs live already. And you got to understand, it's just the timing, right? So Leeway was just part of that crossover, whether it was with Corrosion Conformity, they were from North Carolina, but they moved to New York City, so they would live in there in those circles. You had, Prong and Sick of It All and the Crumbsuckers, all these bands that were real crossover bands. They were their own unique thing. Agnostic Front became a crossover band as well when they did Cause for Alarm record. Because you had two labels out. You had Combat, right? That was like the more of a metal label, but a lot of these bands, some of them were Agnostic Front was on Combat and so forth. But then you also had In Effect Records. That was Howie Abrams who ran that. And it was that was just a sister label of Combat, because they realized that, okay, not everybody who was into the Combat thrash stuff really maybe might not be into the punk, oriented stuff that was coming out in Effect. And the thing is because punks and metalheads didn't like each other, and so it was like oil and water. Leeway was one of the bands. If there's one thing that they brought probably to New York hardcore, wasn't there before, is they brought the metalheads out to the hardcore shows.
So unity, right? Like, between the two, that it was okay to go to a show and like support these bands.
I would say more. It's funny because Eddie said, I wouldn't say unity, would be more community. They maybe community being like, so because they were so metallic, right? You couldn't like mistake those riffs. It was such thrash riffs. Like I said, Mike was a straight up metal guitarist. So they had so much metal in their sound, yet they were this New York hardcore band, but the metalheads couldn't ignore them. And so they were one of those bands, that really brought a lot of the long-haired metalheads out. They got one of the things, I don't know if this is true or not, but I've read or when I've talked to, people or even the band themselves, Eddie and Mike themselves, Leeway was they got a lot of the suburbians to come out to the shows. You know what I mean? So New York hardcore was mostly a very, urban city thing at the time. Now, of course, they played in and around New Jersey and Long Island and New York, upstate New York, all these places. But Leeway was a band that did really well outside of New York City. They did just as good in Long Island, the suburbs, as they did in the city. And so they brought a lot of those fans out, because they were more metallic. And so I would say they were really the band. If you listen to Cro-Mag, Cro-Mag's obviously, they went, metal too when it came to their second record, Best Wishes. But then after that, they kind of, they always had a metal part to their sound, but they were definitely more a hardcore and punk influenced. Same with Agnostic Front, right? Those are usually the bands when people think of New York hardcore and crossover. Those are the bands you usually kind of think of. Leeway was the band that was really like I said, thrash oriented. You couldn't miss it. So it's like if you liked, if you were a metalhead, you like thrash, you listen to Leeway, you're going to be a fan of that band, New York hardcore label or not. And so I would say that's the contribution they made, because if you look at these two albums, when they came out with their third and fourth records, by the time the 90s hit, the whole landscape was changing, as we've been talking about, right? It became more urban influenced. I should say this, there was two ways bands would do it. They either went more, rap influenced, okay? Like Agnostic Front even kind of did that. They got a little more urban style the way they dressed, and with their One Voice record, that went that way. Or you could have went the other way, which is what Leeway did, was more what they would call post-hardcore or post-metal, right? Which is basically sort of alternative-y, grungy type of sound. And so Leeway went that way. And the reason why they went that way, where everyone else really kind of went more the urban way, is because they had a great singer with Eddie. He could sing high notes. He could sing. Those other bands couldn't do that. Biohazard, Agnostic Front, Cro-Mags could not do what Leeway could do musically because they didn't have that vocalist. And so they went that way, more Leeway, to the rock orientation. They really, I think, and they could have been, and they tried to for a little bit if it wasn't for Eddie's, drug issues, but they really tried to become, more of a radio, I guess, kind of friendly band, if you'd say. And they could have done it, and they were good records, especially Open Mouth Kiss. And they had, because they had the singer and the frontman to do it, which no other New York hardcore band, in my opinion, had.
Absolutely. And in saying this is as well as, the Leeway to me, when I first heard it, I kind of thought they were like a huge band. Like this is the band because they were doing, that kind of crossover kind of thing at that time. This is the late 80s we're talking about. So they were kind of ahead of their time with that whole style, would you say? And it's just, I don't know what, since they were kind of ahead of their time, I don't know the bands, what bands they could have toured with to help that name grow to even be bigger, because they were kind of like one of a kind. So with that, again, it's kind of like Motorhead, right? They're like kind of one of a kind at that time that kind of came out and kind of infused two different styles, but making it cohesive to where like both of these fan bases can get into it. Now, I don't know what bands could tour with that.
That's a good question. So the biggest tour, and they did a big tour across the states, out here to California and so forth, was with Bad Brains. Now, I don't think that's your best fit. I think they would have been, I think Leeway, I think what it was with them, they were a very crossover thrash band, but they were touring with more punk bands. They were playing with more punk. Like you said, Bad Brains, look, they're a legendary band, of course, but they sound nothing like Leeway. You know, Leeway, it was more metal. And so I would have loved to see Leeway, tour with a Metallica or do it with those thrash bands, go out with a Testament, or even on the East Coast, go out with some of the thrash bands back there. And really, take it, like I said, but because they were in that scene, the New York hardcore scene, it's interesting because even in the 90s it was the same way. You'd have these different sounding sort of bands within the genre. It wasn't all punk oriented. In the 90s, remember, you had bands like Candiria and these bands that were like jazz metal, you know what I mean? That were in this New York hardcore thing. That's a great question because you're right. I really think if they would have toured with a Corrosion and Conformity or with, Prong and all these bands, and in the 90s, they would have went out with Helmet or something like that, more of the alternative metal bands. Yeah, White Zombie or something. Yeah, I think they would have definitely that was probably their bigger, even though they're used, like I said, in New York hardcore circle. They remind me of really in another band that was like that a lot out here on the West Coast is DRI. DRI was that band that started off though really punk. They were that hardcore punk, but morphed sort of like Suicidal and so on. They morphed into a crossover thrash sound, but they never really abandoned that. Even into the 90s, DRI was still more of a thrashy, metal band. And same with Suicidal. And so I think if they would have done that, they could have, really, but like I said, a lot of it was just, they were just a band that because of their label situation, it really destroyed them, because of those records getting released late. And then by the time those were done in 91, 92, New York hardcore had completely changed. They decided to go more the grunge rock, post-metal, post-hardcore route. Which, like I said, I think they could have done fine on, but because of Eddie's, problems, they did, they toured overseas, they did some European tours and everything, but he had a really bad drug problem, and I think that's what pretty much derailed him in the end, unfortunately.
Sure, and you're mentioning DRI, so they're from Texas, so that would be like mid.
Well, they moved, they are, but they moved to San Francisco in the early mid-80s,
right.
yeah.
So like, it's interesting that like even so, West Coast Suicidal, Midwest DRI, East Coast Leeway. That could have been a great tour package. You know what I mean?
Sure, like I said,
because it would make sense.
Yeah, I mean, they should have just went out with more metal sounding bands. Bad Brains, it's just they don't riff like these guys do. Like you're not gonna most Bad Brains fans, look, like I said, metal and punk were just not sort of mixing well with each other. Now, there's plenty of people out there, of course, like both styles, but you wouldn't have long hair and go to a hardcore show. You get your ass beat. So, and that also happened out in L.A. I mean, talking to Bob, that was the same thing. So that wasn't just an East Coast thing. That was pretty universal, at least here in the States. But yeah, that is a great point. I really think if they would have toured with more metallic sounding bands, they would have been really big in the metal scene. And that's an unfortunate thing is, New York hardcore people love them, but it was really I think the metalheads really could have taken the band, if they would have toured up or hitched to more metal bands instead of, sticking with the New York hardcore punk stuff, they could have been a lot bigger.
And it's interesting that punk fans claim the band. Like they claim it as a punk band.
Yeah, I know. It's I mean, I guess, like you say, if you listen to Born to Expire, there are some songs on there that, sort of very, like I said, hardcore punkish, but more than that, what I mean? But I guess at the time, when they started out in 84, they were called The Unruled in 84. And I guess they had The Enforcer, which is their first demo tape. And that was, I guess, had a little bit more of a hardcore punk feel to it, a little more punk feel. And it wasn't until Born to Expire was starting out where they really, the guitarist AJ incorporated a lot of the metal riffs. But I think it's like we always say, it's because of the scenes, man. Yeah, and I'm with you. I don't musically, I don't get that because a lot of punk people, they hate metal. So it's like I don't understand how you can like Born to Expire or Desperate Measures and say, I like that because it's not as no. I hear very little punk in all Leeway's music. That's just me. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but the musicianship that Leeway specifically has for me is like the next level for like a crossover thrash band.
Yeah.
Like they were musicianship wise, they're the best as far as I'm concerned. I mean,
I agree.
Pokey on the drums, like can't get much better than him behind, having that solid foundation. You can't get much better.
Yeah,
especially
Pokey
with
was Well, Pokey was on Desperate Measures, and he had more of that that groove to it. He had a really good a great punch to his drumming. The first Born to Expire is crazy. The guy who recorded on that, this guy Tony Fonteo, he was a guy they just got. He was from Brazil, and they needed to fill in because I think their drummer quit a little bit before they were recording the album, and he came in and just fucking killed it. I mean, the drums on Born to Expire are outstanding. But yeah, I'm with you. Listen, like I said, that's why they're my favorite New York hardcore band. And even though I don't really consider them musically in that same vein as all the other classic New York hardcore bands, because musically, I mean, they were a step above everybody. They really were. Nobody could sing like Eddie. Nobody can play leads like Mike, and no one could play riffs like AJ. Out of all those bands, in my opinion, you know what I mean? I mean, I just said Cro-Mag's great. Paris Mayhew's a great rhythm guitarist, and obviously Harley Flanagan's a great bassist. But none of those guys could sing. And same with Agnostic Front. Like I said, those guys are a great band, and they're characters and they're great people. Roger and Vinny and stuff. But musically, no one could touch Leeway. Nobody.
And obviously the whole control factor comes into play here when it comes to being in a band. Now, I'm curious for you, besides the drug addiction thing, what could Leeway what could they have done better on, because that was in their control? Because obviously you're mentioning the records, they were recorded earlier, but they came out later. So, I mean, just in terms of maybe songwriting, do you think that could have played a part in having the band continue to garner that legacy, instead of us kind of just talking about the first two albums from the band? Or,
well, look, I'll be honest with you, they could have come back. I mean, they did come back. They did a tour. Mike was telling me in the mid 2000s, they did a European tour. And he said it went really well. They all got along, but there was typical shit on the tour where they got there, and whoever booked it was like they were staying in like these shitty hostels. I mean, like one, sharing, sleeping on floors. And he was like, dude, at that point in his life, he was in his mid 30s or whatever. He had a good job. He was a corrections officer, I think, and or a court officer. I think it was a court officer. And he's like, he basically paid for hotel rooms for them. He's like, we're not living in we're not like 20 years old anymore doing this. But he said it went really well, and the reception's well. But after that, it just, they didn't, I don't know why they didn't I wouldn't say capitalize, but like when you first heard them, 2010, all right, they could have gotten back together. And trust me, I mean, that's why I'd been clamoring it for a few years. I know Mike really, in his discussions and talks with him, and I mean, you can see it on the interviews I've done with him in Aftershocks, and also the one we did with Skull Sessions with Bob. Yeah, he was all about it. I mean, he wanted to get the band back together. It came down to one person. It was AJ, the guitarist. And the bottom line is, I think by then it was too much. I think too much that went on over the years, where it was just too hard to get back out and play with each other again, I guess. And they tried, but basically he told me, Mike, in the end, basically there's guys in the band that won't talk to certain people in the band anymore. So it's your classic. I mean, listen, with AJ, because he was the main songwriter. AJ, him and Eddie founded the band, and he's the main songwriter. He could have gotten. If he could have gotten. I mean, he's kind of disappeared. It's very interesting. I'm really shocked that he hasn't. Maybe now, I don't know if he's gonna, now that these two guys are gone, maybe he feels like, okay, he can go out and tell maybe his side now, whatever it is. But he's just not the type of guy that likes to stir anything up. He doesn't do interviews. He doesn't talk to anybody. And I mean, I think a lot of it, he's probably very disappointed in, ultimately, the amount of work they put in and really the potential he had, and the fact that they didn't reach it. I think it's really probably disappointed them over the years, because I don't understand why they wouldn't come back. They could have dude, they could have been huge again. I mean, really, they could have been playing festivals. They could have been all this stuff, but I think there was too much water under the bridge. There's too much bad blood there. That was hard to put all the water under the bridge, I think, between Eddie and AJ and so forth. And I mean, listen, you saw the documentary, okay? Mike tried, okay? He tried to get everybody in the documentary. The only one who was going to originally do it was Eddie. And then he even backed out at the end. He just was probably tired and was like, I don't want to. You go ahead and do it. I don't want to disturb anything else. I'll give Eddie credit. He's really always sort of protected the legacy. Even when he put the band back together, and it was just him, and they went out and they called themselves LEEWAY NYHC. To let people know it's not the original band. This is, it's basically almost a cover version. It's him and a bunch of different musicians. He got that band, Rhythm of Fear. They're a thrash metal band down in Florida. They were the backing band for a long time, but he got guys in New York to do it. But he put out a couple of songs. He recorded some new songs about 4 years ago. I think 2 or 3 songs. And he tried his best. Mike, got back in there, but he was ill too. Mike, as he passed away, like he said, in December. And his health wouldn't allow him to do it. And I just would have wished that those guys would have been in the documentary, AJ especially, And I think I told you, me and Bob were, just another thing to throw out there. Actually, go ahead to say what you're going to say before.
Well, I was going to say Pokey's in it, but I don't know if that interview was done for the film or if that was just kind of found on somebody else conducted the interview and
it was found on YouTube and stuff.
Okay,
it was YouTube, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just saying so that gives it some, more validity than just Mike Gibbons and
it did because he has to ask some questions, but he didn't get filmed or interviewed for the documentary.
Gotcha.
It was just stuff that he was talking about that someone filmed him outside of a show one day. That was really it. Because he plays for, I don't know if he still does, but I know he was playing for Agnostic Front. I'm not sure. I think he still does. Yeah, he's still their drummer. So yeah, I mean, so they didn't get, like I said, I mean, just here's the movie right here, The Forgotten Ones, that came out. This just came out back in October. This is a new documentary, and me and Bob are both in this, and me and Bob were approached by Mike to do the film with him. Bob obviously was known for his films. Mike respected Bob, was a fan of him, and asked Bob to do it, and asked him, if we would help him. Bob declined. I got involved then, and I was going to help out and do it with them. But one of the things, and I'll just be straight, reasons why I decided not to do the documentary is because of that specific reason. There would be no documentary to me, a LEEWAY documentary, like a real legit one without AJ in it. If you would have had AJ, Mike, and Eddie, that'd have been fine. You didn't need to get Pokey. Just Eddie and AJ, the 2 original members. You got to get them both in there. Eddie was going to do it, and AJ didn't want to do it. Pokey didn't want to do it. Nobody wanted to do it. Zowie, Jimmy the Poodle, the bassist, these guys, none of these guys want to be involved with it. There's a lot of, one of the things I found out, because Mike was even telling me, he was asking guys like even Tommy Victor from Prong and all these musicians to say a few just words about LEEWAY. Just give me a minute to say a great band, blah, 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 blah. They wouldn't even do that because there's so much, interrelationship bickering and all that stuff where these guys didn't want to piss anyone else off. And so they didn't want to be involved in a movie where if AJ's not in there or Pokey's not in there, I don't want to do it then. It's just too much of that because nobody wanted to offend anyone else. And yeah, and Mike was right. In a way, it's kind of silly. All you had to do was just say, yeah, it was a great band. But they just didn't want to be in the movie because they knew that these guys, if AJ's not going to be in it, and if any of the other guys aren't going to be in it, it's, like I said, to me, this should have been called LEEWAY. For when I said The Forgotten Ones, I told Mike, probably not the best of name because it wasn't so much that people forgot about him. The fact is not enough people knew about him. You know what I mean? Is what it was. And he agreed to that. But also it should have been just, sort of been, been marketed more as Mike Gibbons' story of LEEWAY. But listen, he tried to get everybody in it and he wanted to do it. And I'm glad he did it because there is at least something out there on it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I guess you would call it LEEWAY, the Mike Gibbons story.
Pretty much.
That would have been fine with, yeah, but I mean, at least again, something exists of it. The problem is, I just wish they had better representation just throughout their whole career. Cause that seems to be a sticking point with me. With LEEWAY themselves is just, they never got like the proper representation, proper management to represent them, the proper promotion to, gosh darn it. Here, you want that?
One more time. There we go.
There you go. It's not doing it right now. Anyway, but my point still stands is, yeah, it'd be nice. It would have been nice if they had that proper representation, and something exists. That's great. But if this was like done, I don't want to say legitimately because it is still legitimate, but
Sure, I know what you're
you know,
saying. Yeah,
on that kind of higher level, I would have loved to have seen like, you
a
know,
real. I know what you mean. I mean, we all would have. I mean, that's
like
why
sit
when he,
down
yeah,
interviews with like, mic'd up and it would have been
just done the
awesome.
right way, man. I mean, I agree, dude. You know, I mean, as you see in the doc, it's a lot of us, myself and Bob and everyone else that's in it. You know, mostly we just recorded our stuff on our phones. You
Well,
know,
and
yeah.
and not to cut you off here, I'm sorry to do this,
All right.
but like I would have loved to have heard more information on the same things, like because everybody would have had a different side to that story,
Mhm.
and I only got like one or two sides to it.
Well, no, you're right, and most people had said, obviously, expressed the same thing. Like, I would have loved to hear more from AJ or more from Eddie about this and that. And the thing is, because Mike was an original member, he was brought in. I mean, Born to Expire was already done, when he came in, and so he did the leads on the album, but it was already done out. I mean, Desperate Measures. That's why it's such a different record, Desperate Measures, because it has more of Mike's imprint on it. Um, but yeah, I mean, obviously, I would have loved to heard the original. When they first started out, these are guys going to Catholic, they were Catholic school kids. Eddie and AJ and whoever, and they all met up there, and then they just jammed, formed a band, and then boom, I would have loved to heard the early beginnings in the story of Queens about the band. I think everybody would have. But as like we all said, and you said management before. That's a key word because that was, obviously the main. If you watch the film, and it's something that's been synonymous with those bands that were on Profile, the Cro-Mags and Murphy's Law and Leeway, is that the manager, his name was Chris Williamson, and like a lot of managers, he was a bad manager. He took a lot of the money and he did what he did. I mean, at the same time, some of the members over the years were like, look, but without him signing them and managing them, they never would have even made it to this far. So there's a catch-22 there. It's like, okay, well, sure, the guy was an a-hole and he screwed us like a lot of managers do in bands, but he also got them on these tours and did this stuff that they wouldn't have got on themselves. One of the things that Eddie told me interviewing him, during the pandemic about 4 years ago was because I brought that up, obviously, that's always been a big point of contention with the band. And he said, the thing about New York hardcore in general is that the bands were not very organized. There was no metal was very organized. You had your labels, you had your management. It was very organized. New York hardcore was just, it was just a bunch of street kids, mostly. And so obviously, I think that's why a lot of labels, just like they did with rap, they saw rap. It was like, oh, we can make money off these guys and rip them off. I mean, that's what Profile did. To Run DMC, they did that. Profile was, the label they were on was Run DMC's label. And so they did that to Run DMC. They completely screwed those guys over for years. They didn't make any money. And so, like Eddie said, they just weren't. It wasn't organized. The New York hardcore scene. They didn't have all the proper people in the channels and so forth that you go through to eventually get discovered or to go on specific tours and booking agents or whatever what have you. This is all really a DIY thing. New York hardcore, just like punk in general. That's why it's very punk oriented. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of those bands just didn't do it. They just didn't, and they were young. I mean, these are all very young kids too, when they were all signed, and they just got taken for. And yeah, it's unfortunate. But the movie, Leeway, the Forgotten Ones, like I said, in the end, I'm glad Mike did it, even though I understand people's
Their qualms about the film. At least it exists. I mean, dude, it's not easy to do films
no,
in
it's
general.
not, as we know. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it is and it isn't depending on how much you're organized here. But how would you? And I don't want to say in closing because I'm sure we have tons more stuff to talk about. But in your opinion, how would you sum up Leeway's legacy in like a sentence, a paragraph? Like, what is their legacy?
Well, and we could sort of, we're going on an hour here, so I don't want to. I mean, I could speak about Leeway all day. You know what I mean? In New York hardcore in general. Their legacy. Well, as we were basically my take, like I said, they are the best musical wise, musicality wise, talent wise, musicianship wise, the best New York hardcore band to ever have done it. Just straight up, you know. And like I said, because they had pieces in that band that no other band in that scene has. Um, and so, in terms of their legacy, and what's I think what's disappointing is that it could have been so much more. You know, I mean, that's the sad part is, you know, you tell people Leeway who, you know, everybody knows, you know, who obviously Agnostic Front is, even if they're not a fan, they know the name, they know the Cro-Mags. You know, Leeway should have been right up there on par with Cro-Mags, you know, in terms of, you know, all-time great hardcore, New York hardcore band. Unfortunately, a lot of, like I said, people outside of New York don't know much about Leeway, or outside of the East Coast, I should say, Northeast and maybe parts of Europe. Like I said, in the West Coast, you don't see a ton of people. Although I have people, like I said, I have my Leeway shirt. And some people a lot at shows will be like, dude, oh, yeah, great band. Love that shirt. I mean, I get that. I've had a bunch of times it's happened. But yeah, go ahead.
So I want to add to your point, though, because you're mentioning, so the people that know them love them, right?
Yes,
like all
absolutely.
of us, it's because we know them, we love them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's my key takeaway from that. Their legacy is that can't be tarnished from, say, bad management, or didn't get the opportunities that other bands did, or you know, the drug influence and unfortunate circumstances like that. They are the perfect representation of a band where if you know them, you love them.
Absolutely.
That seems to be like the general consensus.
Yeah, that's a great point, man. Yeah, there's very few people that I know that are like, yeah, they're okay. I mean, even buddies I got them into, like later on, are like, oh, that fucking band's great. You know what I mean? It's very, you know, rare when you hear someone be like, yeah, they're okay. You know, it's true. Most people who know them and are into that music, if they love thrash, if you love that crossover stuff, I don't know how you don't love Leeway. I mean,
well, yeah, if you've heard of the band, chances are you love them. That's what their legacy is to me. Is like, and that's like the ultimate legacy that nobody can take away from you. You know,
I agree.
The ultimate test is that your music stands the test of time. And to me, those first two albums stand the test of time. Like I could put it on, like I literally did yesterday, and I enjoyed the heck out of both of them. Still, after what, 30 years, 35 almost, that the records were recorded. So
yeah, and I really hope AJ comes out and keeps this band's legacy alive. I mean, this was his band. You know, I could see him maybe not being maybe a confrontational type of guy. Maybe he just isn't comfortable with that. So all these years where he's been quiet, I mean, very rarely talks about it. Like I said, he doesn't do interviews or nothing, no podcasts or nothing. You know, I just hope that this isn't like, that's it, it's gone. Because like I said, Mike and Eddie were the only ones out there. You know, Pokey, he's with Agnostic Front. And like I said, he was on, you know, but he was on 3 of the albums, you know, 3 to 4 albums. So was Jimmy, the Poodle, the bassist. So, but those guys, really AJ, I'm really hoping that he, you know, it's time for him to give his part of the story now. If he didn't want to kind of go back and forth, I understand that. And I actually kind of, in a way, I kind of respect him greatly for doing that, because you have too many of these, as you see, New York bands, New York hardcore bands. Good Lord. I mean, how many times do these guys fight with each other? Cro-Mags, and I mean, going on a list, they're always grappling and squabbling with each other. It's just, you know, that's New York for you. You know, Type O Negative guys. I mean, you know, there's Sal Abrascato. He's been coming out against those guys lately. And it's just always bickering. And so I respect the fact that he didn't want to get into the weeds and want to, you know, throw himself in there. I get that. I just hope now, though, it's like, okay, AJ, it's you, man. This was your baby, you know, and you now get to really, if you want to direct the story and maybe have it go a different trajectory or whatever it is, you want to make the legacy somewhat different. I really hope you come out and really start representing it again, because this is a band that meant a lot to a lot of people, man. Like, you know, I mean, I know I've talked to people, you know, that loved it because they were, you know, like I said, it was a diverse band too. You had, you know, so a lot of times people like that aspect of it from different cultures that brought that together. That's one thing New York hardcore was really good about. It was very rare back then, but you had a lot of diversity within the bands. And so it means a lot. This band means a lot to a lot of people, including myself. And so for those guys to be gone now, and, you know, it would kill me if that's it. And then we're never going to hear about anyone from the band talking about the band again. I really hope Pokey and Jimmy and AJ all come out and hopefully start, you know, taking hold of that legacy and running with it and doing something with it. Like I said, not have to play, obviously. It's going to be hard to replace a guy like Eddie, although you can listen, as we see, you can replace anybody these days, right? But I would love for him to kind of come out and at least talk about the band more, you know, and stake his claim on that band and his legacy in the New York hardcore history too, you know, which he just kind of likes to, you know, keep on the sidelines. So, I mean, it just sucks, man. You know, thanks for doing this, Tanner. I really appreciate it because, like I said, this is a band that means so much to me. And you know, obviously with these guys gone now, man, it's a big, you know, I mean, it's just a huge void that's left in for New York hardcore too. And you know, I just don't want them to be forgotten. You know, that's my thing. I want people to still not just be forgotten. The music will always, of course, you know, they'll live on through the music, but I don't want people to stop talking about them. You know, I want their legacy to continue to live on.
Absolutely, Matt. Thanks for having me, for thinking of me. You know, you could have picked anybody else in the world to do this with you. I'm honored.
Well, yeah. Well, I first of all, I know you're great at doing this. Secondly, is I know you know the band. You know, like I said,
I
not
love
a lot of
Leeway.
people. Yeah. So exactly. So I mean,
Um,
not everybody could do something like this. So I do appreciate you coming on. And before, so let me just switch gears here. Now before we go here, we'll spend a few minutes talking about what you got going on. Since, like I said, we haven't heard and seen you know, you've in a while now on the CMS network. So talk about what you got going on with your documentaries. Speaking of documentaries.
Oh yeah,
Listen.
yeah. My films. Well, one of them's right there. I needed something to cover up something, so it wasn't a big eyesore for the people watching. You know. So yeah, no, I just did a. I guess I can show it here. I literally just got them and did it myself. Was the Heretic. Don't Turn Your Back. The Story of Heretic. It was my first film. You want to talk about again like I wanted to do them justice, right? Like I did not want like a documentary like you know, some of the ones we were talking about, you know, off the record here, right? But I wanted to do the band justice. So it's kind of like what Leeway is, right? It's like a band that like people know, they love, but they've never really got like the proper representation. And I was trying to be that guy to give them the respect and representation and tell their story in a way that like doesn't it's not venomous. It literally tells I like the musical landscape of things, right? So anything that I do, I like to just focus strictly on the music. And I think this documentary, this film, does that justice. You know, for the people who have seen it, they're really into it. They really dig it. It's gotten you know, a lot of killer accolades, and I hope it gets more just for the band's sake. Not forget me. You know, the band I feel deserves it. You know, they've been around for 40 years.
Yeah, wow.
And
Metal Blade
you know,
Records too, for people out there that don't know Heretic. You know, it wasn't like they were just some, you know, band in your backyard there. I mean, they were on a big label, and obviously it is a great story, dude. I mean, you did a great job on the film, and people should really check out that film. The story itself is really cool. You know, it's very different. It's a very unique story, you know, and what happened. And, you know, you know, I think we were talking a little bit about that, you know, like a band like Leeway and Heretic. There's a lot of sort of similarities in terms of their career. And maybe sometimes, I think I told you, like, you know, it's kind of like, you know, Leeway, there were a bunch of nice guys, Leeway, you know what I mean? They were good people. They were nice guys. They were very polite and whatever. And you know, Heretics kind of very reminds me of that too. They're just a band that were really good guys. Sometimes being in this industry, if you're a good, quote unquote good guy, it ain't going to get you very far, and it can be detrimental in terms, you know, of certain things. But yeah, great story, and also a really cool, you know, cover there. Just to let you know.
thank you. Yeah, I wonder who did it. Oh wait, that would be
tell that guy he's the best like artist ever, man. I don't know. I mean,
yeah, man, that would be the famous, the one and only, the legend himself, Mr. Matt Hartnett. Yeah, for helping me out with that.
Just play with you, man. Yeah, no,
putting that together. Yeah. And I got to give a shout out to Super Tom because he helped me put this whole thing together. Again, this is like total DIY, but I did my best to make it as professional looking as possible, and it's all done out of love. And I know it's kind of resonated with people that they when they see this, it's not just like a phony product. Like I really tried to, like, you know, again, that control factor where I wanted it to look a certain way and feel like this is legit. Like it's not just like a DIY, you know, thrown together with some Xerox paper. And I feel it does the band justice. You've seen it, and I'm sure we'll talk about it hopefully on a upcoming episode.
We are going to be doing that. Yep. Very soon. We'll be having Tanner and one of the guys from Heretic on here on Aftershocks to promote the film. So people will definitely stay tuned for that. That'll be coming up over the next few weeks, I believe. Yeah,
absolutely. And I want to thank you again, seriously, for all the support and influence that you and Bob specifically, and Chris, gave me in order for me to get to this point, right? Because that's I feel like everybody needs to get their their just due, and that's really important for me. Which is why I'm here talking about Leeway, because I want them to get their just due, and great bands. And so thank you again for being a part of this. I completed my second film, The Legacy of Sideshow Studios, which is premiering at the Gardena Cinema on June 29th, and tickets are selling really well. So definitely check out that. And yeah, I don't know how much we can say, so I'll leave that to you, but I'm involved in a couple projects, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. This will be available on streaming soon. So thanks again for having me, Matt.
Yeah, of course. Well, let's just really quickly, before we do wrap things up here, we will let people know. Well, for one, like I said, we're going to be featuring Tanner here in a couple of weeks with The Heretic. We're going to be talking about the doc with one of the band members. But also, both myself and Tanner, we have a film ourselves that's in the works right now. The film shoot, everything's been done, everything's been filmed. It's just now doing the editing part, and we're hoping to get that out by early next year, 2025. We will, I guess, it's one of those things I've been very hesitant to get into details about it, obviously, until it's just no point in getting it until it's really, we're going to get a trailer out there for everybody. I think once we do that, we'll start talking about it a little bit more. But it's going to be, me and Tanner, it's my first film. He's obviously done a couple here already. So he obviously, has helped me through this. And I think we're going to do something that's going to make, that's a lot of people are going to really enjoy. It's really, I will say it's based within the heavy rock scene, so if you want to learn about those kind of bands, check out Seismic Sounds of the Underground. There's some bands in there that if you want to get an idea, it's along the heavy rock, the stoner, and the doom stuff. But not just that. We've also got some metal musicians in there as well. So it's not just that. And like I said, it's I think it's going to be cool. And it's going to be one of the first of many films we plan on doing. But, we'll obviously talk about those other ideas and films we're going to be doing another time. But we will be, obviously, as we get closer to things getting complete, we will be discussing it more and really releasing a lot more information on it. So yeah,
absolutely. And no animals were hurt during the filming. I guarantee it.
Yeah. Well, we still got some time. Maybe we'll, no, I'm just kidding. Yeah.
You always put that disclaimer. So
yeah, exactly. But yeah, man. All right. Well, Tanner, man, I really appreciate you coming on. It's always great having you on the Aftershocks. And like I said, Tanner will be co-hosting some of these shows going forward with me as well. He's going to be, obviously everyone knows Tom Brennan is my co-host now, but when we have sort of some other topics and so forth, I'm going to get, Tanner involved. We're going to get Chris Aiken on here. We're going to get some other guests, to co-host with me on here as well and talk about specific genres and topics and all that good stuff, whatever comes to mind. A lot of great stuff to talk about out there, obviously, always is. But yeah.
Absolutely. And if you would like a copy of the Heretic film, please go to poppittproductions.com. It is all the information is available. It's POPPITT productions.com. And yeah, I hope you'll support not only myself, but a great band and learn a little bit about music history.
Yes. And it is a really cool piece of music history, especially if you're a metal fan, like a good old speed metal, thrash metal fan. I think you're going to really, like that documentary. You did a great job on it, Tanner. So yeah, can't wait for it to come out for everyone to check out. And as always, so yes, thanks everyone for tuning in to AFTERSHOCKS TV. For Mr. Tanner Poppitt, I'm Matt Hartnett, and we'll see everybody next time. Take care.
Cheers.